Hello and welcome back to the shop. Today I'm going to take you through the steps of how to reseal an engine pan on a BR600 backpack blower. Now this is something that is quite common on these blowers as well as the BR700s as well. I do several of them a year, so I do see it quite a bit. So what I'll do is I'll take you through the steps of how to first inspect the blower to determine whether or not you need to have the pan resealed. And then I'll take you through the steps of disassembly and then how to reseal it and then reassembly as well. So if you've never done anything like this before yourself, you can definitely do it yourself at home. You really don't need any kind of specialty tools to do it, just some basic things that I'll go ahead and show you, but otherwise something you can totally do at home. So in just a second, I'll bring you in closer and then I'll show you exactly what you need to look for. All right, so today I've got a commercial customer here that has a BR600. He was complaining that this thing was hard to start and it was making some noise and just not running well at all. So if you saw my videos on common problems for the BR600, BR700 backpack blowers, I covered a lot of this information as far as how to inspect it, but I'll just run over it really briefly on this blower here. I'll link that video up above if you haven't seen it. So one thing with these blowers, one thing you're going to want to look for on the outside of these blowers, just as a visual inspection, is right here at the base of the recoil, you'll see a lot of oil right here leaking. And this bottom bolt on the recoil, you'll see a lot of oil built up around here, and then you'll get a lot of oil that's built up right along the top of the gas tank here. Now, that is usually a sign that the engine pan is leaking on one of these blowers. Not always though. I will show you one more thing that it could be inside of here. A lot of times the primer, or it'll have a bad fuel line or carburetor, and then that fuel will run down and it'll get caught up in here and the flywheel and whatnot, it'll blow out. So that is something that could be as well. But most of the time it's a leaking engine pan. So let me take the engine cover off of this thing and then I'll take you through the steps of just a quick visual inspection. Okay, now that I've got the recoil pulled off of this thing, you can see all of the oil inside the recoil housing itself. And then in the flywheel area here, you can see how wet it is all around that flywheel. That's usually a good indicator of a leaking engine pan. So you want to look for those things. Now the next thing I'll do is I'll pull this outer housing off and then I'll show you the engine itself. Okay, with the engine cover off of it, again, you can see all of the wetness here, all the leaking. And one thing you're going to look for is down in here, you can see that bolt sticking out. Now that is an engine pan bolt. And that is typically what happens with these units, is the vibration will cause the bolts to loosen up and they'll back out and fall off. Luckily this one got hung up in there and it didn't come out. But usually these front ones, these front bolts right here will come out, or the heads of them will break off, and what I've seen happen is they will get caught up in the magnet and then they will wedge themselves between the coil and then they will just cause all kinds of damage. So if you have one of these blowers and you see that little bit of oil on the outside around the recoil, or if it's not running right, hard to start, surging, that type of thing, you're going to want to go ahead, pull that recoil off and just do a quick visual inspection around the flywheel to make sure that this engine pan is not leaking and then it's tight. So another thing that I did say earlier as far as what could be a potential leak as well, what I see is every once in a while these primers will go bad, or if the carburetor shaft itself is severely worn. I did another video on that as well, leaking carburetor shafts, and a lot of times that fuel from either the primer or the shaft will leak down the side of the engine right here. It'll get drawn in and then spun around and blown around. So you may not have an engine pan leaking. It could just be from up here, but you will really see it up here. It'll be really wet up here and it'll be a lot of dirt impacted because the dirt's just going to stick to it. So it'll be really noticeable, and it'll be really noticeable down the air cleaner box as well. But obviously in this case with that loose bolt down there, this is definitely an engine pan. So next I'll go ahead and I'll set the camera up above me and I'll go ahead and take you through the steps of disassembly. All right, I'm gonna start tearing this thing down. I've got you up above. As I've stated in my other videos, I like to work on these things on their back. It makes it a lot easier for me anyway. I'm just comfortable doing it that way. So these things are pretty simple to take apart. So not a lot to them. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go ahead and disconnect the coil. And then I'm gonna disconnect the coil wires. You're just gonna pop them off the coil. And then the wire follows along right here in this channel. Just go ahead and pop that out of here for now. You could take it out ahead of time if you want, like this. Doesn't matter, just to get it out of your way. Next, there's a screw right here, and then there's one up here in the corner. You're going to take these out. And then you can take this plastic engine cover off and get it out of your way. Next, I'm going to go ahead and disassemble the fuel system. Now what I like to do is I don't like to mess with the fuel lines, disconnecting them, then you got fuel spraying all over the place and leaking everywhere. So I take the tank off and I take the carburetor and the air box, everything all off in one unit. That way I can just, it stays sealed and I can get it out of my way all in one shot as well. So I'll show you that. So what you're going to do is there's two screws that hold these tanks on the bottom. So you're going to go ahead and take these screws out. And then that loosens the tank. Next, I'm going to take the two screws off the carburetor. And then what you got to do, sometimes these things will stick to the carburetor, to the intake, so just take a screwdriver and kind of lightly pop it off the intake itself. And then you're going to take your pulse tube and then just pop it off the tube on the carburetor. Go ahead and lay this thing over. Take your throttle cable, and it goes inside this housing right here. You're going to go ahead and just pop your throttle cable out and disconnect it from the carburetor, and now your throttle harness and everything is out of your way, and you can go ahead and toss it aside. Okay, with that disconnected, now you can take your entire fuel system, leave it sealed up, and then just go ahead and set this off to the side. That just makes that a little bit easier to deal with. Okay, next what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this thing completely over. And you have to disconnect the volute and the engine and everything from the back plate itself. So there's 4 screws here. So if you just take these straps, you'll see one right here, and then there's one over here on this side, and then there's 2 down here on the bottom. So go ahead and take those out. You can either take them out completely, or you can just kind of leave them in there, and the straps and everything will just kind of hold them in place. So go ahead and lift this off and get this out of your way. Okay, next you've got the volute here. You're going to take all of these screws off of this housing all around the outside here. Okay, now that you got all those screws loose, down here in the corner or over here in this corner, you've got a little bit of gap between the 2 volutes. Just get a screwdriver. You might have to get in there to kind of pry it up. Sometimes these things can be a little bit sticky, a little bit stubborn to get off. Whoops, I forgot a screw. There's one hiding back here. Sometimes they can be a little sticky. Once it gets broken loose, you can go ahead and separate it. You'll have to give it a pretty good yank, like that. Okay, now I can get my tube and this volute out of the way. I'll just set those aside. All right, so the next thing you gotta do is take this fan off. Now, these older designs, unlike the BR800, this nut is integrated into the fan, so you have to take the entire fan off. So to do that, you need to have a piston stop. So what you're gonna do is pull the spark plug out. And then I'm going to take my piston stop, and you're going to go ahead and run it in there. Make sure the piston's down. And one thing you want to do with these, you want to make sure, is when you're screwing this piston stop in, is you want to make sure that you bottom that thing out and run it all the way down. Because when you go to loosen that fan, you're putting a lot of pressure on that piston, pushing on this piston stop. And if you don't have that thing threaded all the way in there, you can push the threads right out of the block, so be careful of that. Okay, so with the piston stop in, I'm going to go ahead and flip it back over on the fan side. Now I'm going to go ahead and loosen this fan. So to loosen the fan, I just have a big breaker bar here with a 17 millimeter, or you can use an 11/16 socket, either one, whichever works for you. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll stand this thing up. I'll spin the engine around so I know it's on the piston stop. Just go ahead and tap it so I know it's on there. And then just hold this thing really steady. You're going to have to put some force into it and then just break it loose. Once it's broke loose, you can just spin the fan right off. There you go. So now to take the engine off of the housing itself, you've got 4 screws. You've got 2 down here and 2 up here. Now what I find a lot of times with these things is these upper ones, because this is the upper part of the engine, if you will. These upper ones will be torqued extremely tight, and then these are usually a little bit looser, so the impact will take these off, but it won't take these off all the time. So to take those, I've got a T27 T-handle, so I'll just go ahead and I'll crack these loose. Now I can just take this housing off and I'll just set it aside. All right, so here we have the engine, and here you can see the loose bolt and the leaking engine pan itself. Next, I'll go ahead and disassemble this thing. I'm going to take the muffler off first. There's 3 bolts that hold the muffler on. Take that and get it out of the way. Now this muffler is coming apart. This is something, especially with the BR800s, that is very common. You can see where it's falling apart there, so I'll replace this muffler for the customer. I got plenty of used ones. The metal on it just starts cracking and falling apart on it, so I'll take care of that later. Something to be aware of, though, to keep an eye out for. So the next thing I'm going to do, what I'll do to take this thing apart, is I'm going to take the piston stop out, and I'm going to take the rocker cover off. So what I like to do is I like to put this engine on what is called overlap. When you're spinning this engine around, you have top dead center, which is your compression stroke. And then 180 from that is you have overlap, where it's between your intake and your exhaust valves opening. So I'm going to put that thing on overlap. So what you can see here is the valves moving. So the flywheel is pointing at top dead center, if you will. So right now the piston's on top dead center, and you can see the rocker arms rocking just slightly there. So that's what's called overlap. So I like to put it on overlap, and then I'll go ahead and I'll take this engine pan off. And of course this thing's not going to take any effort to take off at all. So you can see it's been leaking pretty bad. This thing has definitely been loose for a while. So now what you can do, depending on the age of the unit, you don't always have to do the crank seals. So when you put this thing on overlap, basically it just kind of helps hold everything together, if you will. Now, you could just clean this surface up, reseal it, and put it back on. Or if you feel like you need to check the crank seals themselves, you can go ahead and pull the crankshaft out at this point. So what I'll do is I'll pull the crankshaft out just so I can inspect the seals, because this is a commercial customer, and you know, he uses the heck out of this thing too, so they're probably pretty whooped. So now I can go ahead and just pop this crankshaft out of here. And that's where it's nice to have this thing on overlap, because it'll hold the valves in place while I do this. Sometimes these things can just be a little bit sticky to get out of here. The crank bearings are wedged into the case. There we go. Just gonna pop that right out of there. So there's your crankshaft and then your engine block. So now, what I was talking about with the valves on overlap, the lobe of the cam is pointed straight up, and now this cam gear doesn't move around. It doesn't roll around on you. So when you retime it, it makes it a little bit easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the crank seals off. And what you can do is you can just kind of use your fingernail and push on the edge of them on the inside just to see how stiff they are. These are definitely getting a little bit stiff, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to definitely replace these for the customer. So what you can do is just take this flywheel, you're going to take it off. So you're going to take this nut off, set that aside. And now to get this flywheel off, all you got to do is just lightly tap it. It's a tapered shaft. So if you just lightly tap it, it'll pop right off the crankshaft. You don't need a special pull or nothing like that. Now I can take the inside crank seal off and get it out of the way, and I'll go get some new ones. And then while I'm in here, of course, I'm going to inspect the bearings. Not only am I going to feel them, spin them, but I'm going to try to move them this way as well, see if there's any kind of movement in them. And these feel really good. Another common problem with these Stihls and the BR600 and 700s is the wrist pins seizing up. So I'm just going to make sure this piston feels really good and it's moving around nice on the wrist pin itself. This one looks pretty good. I don't feel anything. I don't see any issues with that at all. So what I'll do is I'll set that aside for now and then I'll clean it later. I don't need to pull this cover off. These I really never see leaking. I never see any issues with them. The earlier Stihls did have some cam shaft issues in here where your cam is. There's a metal plate that holds the compression release on the cam. In the earlier years, they did have problems with those plates coming off, but I don't see that issue anymore. So what I'll do is I'll just take a flashlight and I'll look down in there, and you'll be able to see that metal plate on the cam itself. And basically you just want to make sure it looks like it's on the cam and it's not hanging off. You'll see it'll be separated from the plastic cam wheel itself. But this one looks really good. I don't see any issues with it. And the cam gear looks really good. I'm just going to do a quick inspection of the cylinder. Everything looks good on this thing. So I can go ahead and get this thing cleaned up and get it ready for reassembly. Now the engine pan itself, a lot of times what will happen with these things is they can crack, or in this case, these bolts were loose for a very long time and the vibration actually caused these bolts to sink into the engine pan itself from the wear. So that is one thing to look out for. So I will most likely replace this pan because of it. And another way that you can check to make sure your pan is not cracked, you can clean it and visually inspect it. But a quick way to check it is if you have a metal surface like this, if you just drop it, you can definitely hear a tone in it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to clean it and get all the grease off of it first, and then I'll get a new one, and then I'll do them side by side so you can hear the comparison between the two. So let me get this stuff cleaned up. I'm just going to take it to my tank. You can use brake parts cleaner. That's usually the best thing to use, or some kind of solvent. I have a solvent tank here, so I'm just going to put everything in the solvent tank and get it cleaned up. All right, so I got everything cleaned up here. I got the engine block cleaned up. I just got to clean the silicone off of that. Not a big deal. I just kind of ran it through the tank. You don't have to go crazy making it super clean. You want to just make sure that this bottom edge is clean for sure. And then the engine pan itself, it does not feel like it's, or look like it's cracked anywhere. But one thing with these that you'll notice here, I'm going to try to get it to where the camera will pick it up, but you can see that little ridge right there. Try to get a couple different angles here. Now that's supposed to be a completely flat machine surface all the way across there. Now this pan was loose for a long time, so basically it's just shaking in there on the engine itself, on the block, causing that ridge. So it caused excessive wear here where it mates to the engine block itself. So when I see that, I'm definitely going to replace the pan. I'm not going to mess with it because it just won't seal properly, and now your clearances and stuff between the crank bearings are going to be off as well. So for the price of an engine pan, I'm just going to replace it. These things are definitely on this bolt here too. It definitely wore into this one a little bit more than normal as well. So for those two reasons, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to replace this pan. Now, this one, like I said, it feels okay. I don't see any cracks in it. One way to check to see if these things are cracked, sometimes you can't see them, is again, if you have a metal surface like this, if you just drop it, you can hear how tingy it is. Now, when these things are cracked, it'll just kind of go thud. It'll be like that when you drop it on the steel table. So you want it to sound like that. You'll hear it. It'll have a nice little ring to it. And that's a good, quick way to check these for cracks. Make sure it's not. Here's a new one. So you can definitely hear that tinging sound, if you will. So you can see the two bolt holes, the differences on these edges here, and how they wear into the case. And then on the other side, hopefully you can kind of see the difference. This one's perfectly flat and machined all the way across. And then the other one's got just a little bit of a ridge. So it's always a good idea just to replace these engine pans if you question them at all. They're not that expensive to replace. And it's just good, cheap insurance. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this thing over and I'm going to clean and get all this silicone off of here. And you could either use a razor blade and go over this, get the silicone off. We actually have a big industrial bench mounted wire wheel that has really soft wire on it. So it doesn't, it won't cause any kind of damage. You just don't want to get real aggressive with these when you clean the surfaces. Scotch-Brite, razor blade, the silicone off, a little bit of Scotch-Brite, some brake parts cleaner, just touch it up. Not a big deal. You don't have to go nuts on it. You just don't want to cause any kind of damage to it. All right, so I got this engine block cleaned up, ready to go. And again, that's just with the wire wheel that I have, and then I hit it with some brake parts cleaner and wash off any of the grease and anything else that might be left over. You want this surface to be really clean. You do not want any old silicone or oil on it, and I'll explain that here in a minute. Another thing when you're cleaning these things, I just kind of blew this off lightly with some brake parts cleaner. Try not to get into this wrist pin and worry about cleaning this too much. Do not get in here and blow brake parts cleaner in there, carb cleaner. And I'm a little gun shy with these wrist pins on these BR600s because they do have a lot of problems with them locking up, and I just don't like to, if it's been running fine and it's been a good unit and there hasn't been any problems with it, I just don't like messing with it basically. So, don't worry about the wrist pin too much. You can apply a little bit of light oil to it once you do a reassembly. But otherwise, the bearings are cleaned up, ready to go. Everything feels good and sounds good. I don't see any issues with the crankshaft itself. Now, with the used engine pan, when you clean these things, you've got this recessed groove in here that actually holds the silicone in. You want to make sure that you get every bit of that silicone out of that groove. A lot of times it'll just pull right out. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a bear. Again, that's why I have a big wire wheel or industrial wire wheel. If you have a Dremel or something like that with a little wire wheel on it, you can get in there and just get it out. You don't want to use anything aggressive. Don't use an 80 grit sandpaper or something that aggressive. Just a nice light wire wheel, just touch it up, or a wire brush even for that matter. Just try to get all of that silicone out of that groove on this entire engine pan and you'll be good to go. But in this case, I'm going to replace it so I don't have to worry about it. All right, so now I've got everything basically ready to go. I've got a brand new engine pan here. My crankshaft is clean and my engine block is clean and ready to go. I can start the reassembly process. And I have new crank seals here as well. I'll put all these part numbers and everything down below, so if you want to get these parts, you can find them. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put these crank seals on the crank itself. You can oil these a little bit if you would like. You don't have to. I just have a little bottle of 2-stroke oil here. So I'm just going to put just a tiny, tiny bit of oil on my finger. Just wipe it on the crankshaft. And next, when you put the crank seals on, you'll see this side of it and then the other side. This is the outside, so this points out. So just go ahead and slip that over the crank and kind of give it a little bit of a rock to get it on there. And you'll feel it'll slide right on. Just go ahead and push it all the way on there. Close up to the gear on this side. This side, same thing. This is the outside of the seal. This is the inside of the seal. You're going to put that towards the inside. Point it towards the bearing. And now you have both your seals on the crankshaft ready. Ready to go. Okay? So next what I'll do, since I clean this, I'm just going to go ahead and apply just a tiny bit of oil to the piston rings themselves. You don't need much at all. Just put them on there, spin them around. One thing with Stihl, there's no piston ring stops, so you can spin these 180 degrees, it doesn't matter. Next what I'll do is I'll hold the crankshaft like this, and I'm just going to put just a tiny bit of oil on the bearings themselves, and then just give it a spin, just to make sure it feels good and everything's getting oil. You don't have to do this, it's just peace of mind. I mean, I've built a lot of engines, so it's kind of a peace of mind for me, but a lot of times you can put these things together dry. They usually are pretty much dry from the factory, so it really doesn't matter because, when it's running, it's getting oil immediately. So, all right, next, I'm going to go ahead and put this in. So, as I stated before, with this cam wheel, see, I cannot move this cam wheel very easily. It's locked in place. And that's because, again, this thing is on what's called overlap, so it cannot move. You can see the rocker arms moving there as I move the cam wheel. So right now, the lobe of that camshaft is pointed straight up. That's exactly where I want it. So when you time this thing, what you're going to do, you're going to go ahead, you really don't have to hold the piston rings on these things because the cylinder is tapered. So go ahead and drop. Here's your gear, your cam gear, and then here's your cam gear. You're going to go ahead and drop your piston in, and just give it a little bit of a wiggle. I'm going to put this on the bench. Just give it a little bit of a wiggle, and it slides right in. Now you're going to go ahead and drop your crankshaft straight down. Now what you're going to do is you want to keep that piston pointing straight up, if you will. So if you put this thing in and you just let it hang, you want that piston to just kind of hang there and drop it straight in, so that piston is up in the cylinder all the way. You're going to drop this thing in there until it hits the cradles, and then you just kind of hold it in place. You can see it seated in there. Next, what I'll do is I'll just kind of push on these seals to make sure they're in there. And now the crankshaft is all the way in. So what you're going to do to check your timing is I'm going to spin this thing over and I'm going to hold the crank, and I'm going to look inside the spark plug hole, and I'm going to watch the rocker arms, and I'm going to rock this crank back and forth like this. And as I do that, you can see the rocker arms moving. So when you do that and you look in the spark plug hole, that piston should be at top dead center as you're doing that. It'll come up and go down, up and down. As the rocker arms are doing this, the piston is going to go like this, up and down on top dead center. So that tells me that I'm timed properly. So now, I'm going to make sure my crank seals are in place. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to double clean this surface. Now you want to make sure, I like to make sure that these surfaces are surgical clean. I want to make sure they're spotless before I put silicone on them. So I'm going to go over this again with some brake parts cleaner and a rag just to make sure it's clean. So I'm just going to wipe this down to make sure there's no oil on it. I'm going to wipe the seal as well, just the top of the seal. And I just want to make sure this thing is clean. Now the engine pan, because it's brand new, I don't have to do too much to it. These things are really clean. I don't have to worry about them. I'll just run over it real quick just to make sure. That's all that needs. Now, I'm going to use the Stihl, the factory lube that they recommend, which is this here. You can use ultra black, ultra gray. I've used them all, and I've never noticed a difference between any of them. So you can pretty much use anything you want. Now you're going to apply the silicone on the engine pan, and you're going to make sure that it gets inside that groove all the way around this pan. You do not have to apply a ton of this stuff. It does not require a lot at all, just a very fine amount. So you're going to just go ahead, I just put it on there, work it into that groove is my main goal. And then just go around the pan. You don't have to do the saddles. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. Again, you just want to make sure that that groove has silicone in it. And that's all you need. There's not very much on there. Even though it might look like it's a lot, there really isn't at all. So when you tighten this thing down, what you don't want is you don't want silicone squirting inside the crankcase and outside and just all over the place. I've seen some of them that were just a mess, even from the factory. So you don't have to go crazy with these things. Okay, next, I'm going to hold this, and then you have this part of it. You've got 3 different steps here, and that part goes towards the cam gear. So you're just going to put that on there like that, set it on there. You're going to have a tiny, tiny gap all the way around until you get your bolts on. So next, take your bolts and put them in. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run these down with my impact lightly just to get them started. Once I got them all started, I'll just hit them a little bit. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit all these and torque them up by hand. I've done this long enough that I basically feel the torque by hand. You just get them good and tight. You don't have to go nuts on them. So I'm just going to go around in a crisscross pattern and tighten them all up. And that's all you need to do. You don't have to go nuts. You don't need to worry about having a torque wrench and all that stuff. Just get them good and tight. And then your silicone should stick out about like that all the way around. Just a nice clean bead all the way around. Okay. So that's basically it for the short block. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my flywheel back on, and I'm going to double check my timing. So these flywheels, there is a keyway in these flywheels. You can see it there. And then that does correspond with the groove in the crankshaft. So you want to make sure that that keyway slides in the crankshaft. Just give it a quick shake and a wiggle, make sure that it's set in there nice and tight. And then you can go ahead and put your nut on and tighten the nut up. I'm just going to hit that a little bit. That's all that's going to need. Now when the flywheel, this part of the flywheel is hitting the coil right here, that's when you know the piston's at top dead center. So as I rock this back and forth, and I'm going to double check my timing. As I go back and forth, the piston is straight up. I can see it up there moving up and down, and the rocker arms are rocking. So now I'm going to go around, and I'm going to put it on the compression stroke, top dead center. And I'm going to double check my valve lash. It feels pretty good. I'm going to tighten it up. You want to set these, I set them at about 10 thousandths. Again, I've been doing this so long, I just I know by feel anymore. So, okay, those feel good. Now I'm just going to go ahead and spin this thing over a couple times to make sure everything feels good. Rocker arms are working properly. Now it's ready to go. I can put the rocker arm back on it and start the reassembly process. If I didn't explain the timing very well on that, I'm sorry. Sometimes I have a hard time explaining some things like that. That's how it works good for me in my mind, because I don't want to try to hold the camshaft in place while I'm trying to put the crank in place. So if you put it on overlap, you know, the valve springs are actually holding the cam gear in place so it can't move. There are plenty of other videos online too if you get a little confused at what I was saying with the timing on this thing. So let me put the rocker arm back on, or the cover I should say. Put that on, tighten it up. Now I'm going to put my piston stop back in, so I'm going to put the piston down, and I'm going to put my piston stop back in because it's just the reverse procedure, putting it back together again. All right, so I had to go get a muffler for this customer. That other one was bad. This one's good, just a rusty old used one. So I can put this muffler back on. I'm just going to put the bolts back in the hole, get the bolts to stick out, and then I'm going to put it on here. You want to be careful with these because you can strip these out pretty easily if you're not careful. So get them all started first, and then go ahead and run them down. Takes care of that. Now to put this thing back together again, I'm just going to lay it down like this. This is the flywheel side or the cam side. And then you can take your housing. Your bolts are already in there still. Go ahead and drop it on there. Just make sure it's seated all the way down, and then you can tighten all these bolts up. Now you could hear that these two bolts were really tight, and they went in really tight, and that's because the engine pan is new. These bolts cut their own threads as they go into the aluminum on the pan, so that's why those sounded tight compared to these two up here. So now I got those tight. I'm just going to double check them by hand just to make sure everything's okay. Give them a good twist. Okay, now I can go ahead and put the fan back on. I'm going to go ahead and spin this thing on the shaft. Now I'm going to spin it around until it hits the piston stop. You can hear it. And then I'm just going to give this a little tighten. You don't have to go much. Again, you don't have to go crazy on this stuff. So this is ready to go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it like that. And I'm going to get my tube. I like to put just a little bit of lube on the housing on these things. They have an O-ring on the tube. So what I'll do is I'll set the tube in place, and then here's the O-ring. It just helps that O-ring, helps everything move nice and free. Now I can go ahead and put this back together. Just reverse order of how you took it apart. Put the two volutes together. And then just double check it all the way around to make sure it's all the way down. And then you can take all your screws and put all your screws back on and tighten them up. So when you put your back plate back on, you just go ahead and leave this thing exactly the way it is. Go ahead and grab your frame, and then you can just lay it over. And then you're going to want to make sure that you hit the pockets on all these springs. You'll see it on the frame. It sets inside of these here. So go ahead and drop this down. Now it's set in place. Just hold it. And if you left your screws in there, they're ready to go. And just tighten these up. These you do not have to tighten very tight. You don't want to go crazy on them, otherwise you'll strip them out. And now that your frame is on there, you can flip it back over. You can go ahead and take your piston stop out. You no longer need this. Then you can take your throttle cable. I'll wipe this down real quick. You can clean the housing and all this stuff if you want to as well. I'll usually pressure wash them afterwards. Now we can go ahead and reassemble the fuel system. Again, it's all kept together in one shot. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to blow all this off and just give it a quick clean and an inspection. The tank vents on these Stihls are also known for giving you grief and problems. So I'm going to go ahead and just clean this real quick and blow it all off and make sure it's all right. All right, I got these cleaned up and ready to put back on. So now what you're going to do is you're just going to set the fuel tank in place. You don't have to worry about mounting it right now. And then you can take this carburetor and air box, set it in place. Go ahead and push your fuel lines down there. And then you're going to take your throttle cable and you're going to hook this up first. So you're going to hook it up to the carburetor. And then you're going to put it in the little pocket right here. And then the cable slides in the groove right here. So your fuel lines and your throttle cable should look like this once it's assembled. Everything sits inside of a channel here, nice and neat and out of the way. So once you've got that in place, go ahead and roll it over. You're going to have to kind of hold the throttle cable a little bit in place. Lay it down. Go ahead and hook up your pulse tube here on the bottom of the carburetor, the big tube. Put that on there. And then you can go ahead and slide the carburetor in place. And these two where the two screws are, top and bottom, you'll feel it. It'll slide onto the studs and it'll kind of sit there. Now I'm going to make sure my throttle cable is pushed into the housing here. The wiring you can just kind of leave out of the way. You don't need to worry about it just yet. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and tighten the two bolts for the carburetor. And you may have to twist this intake manifold just a little bit just to get the bolts to line up. Get them both started before you tighten them. And just snug them up. That's all you need to do there. Now I'll go ahead and I'll put this plastic engine cover back on, this one here. Just pull the coil wire out of the way, slide this thing down. Then you could put these two screws on, and those are these two screws here. One down here on the bottom, one on the top. I'm going to tighten the top one. Start the bottom one here. I'm going to put my wires in first so I can lift this up a little bit to tuck them under. There's two little tabs that the wiring harness slips under. Now I can go ahead and hook up the coil. Now this one, again, this is a brand new engine pan, so this is going to cut the threads as it goes in, so it's going to feel a little bit tighter. Okay, that's good to go, all tight. Fuel lines are good, everything's out of the way. Now I can tighten the fuel tank up. Okay, fuel tank's mounted, good to go. Now I can put a spark plug in it. Tighten the spark plug up. You can put the plug wire boot back on. Now this thing is ready for the engine cover. Okay, so with the engine cover, I'm just going to wipe it down real quick, but one thing that I addressed on my BR700 and 600 backpack blower common problems videos was these spacers right here. And these little spacers go inside the housing here. There's three of them where the recoil bolts up. Now these serve a purpose. You want to make sure that they are in there when you put this back together again, but they are prone to falling out of the plastic and they can get caught up in the flywheel and cause damage. So you want to make sure that they are all there. These things are not only act as a spacer for proper spacing for the recoil to the flywheel, but they also center the recoil as well in the flywheel. So just want to push them. Sometimes they'll just fall out because they're loose, but if you just kind of slide them back inside the housing, usually they'll stay there. If they won't stay there, if they're really loose, you can put like a little bit of grease on them and then just slide them back in here. If you put some grease on this backside, it'll hold them in place while you get them and put the cover back on. And again, double checking, make sure all your spacers are in there. I'm just going to give this thing a quick wipe down before I put the recoil on. And I'm going to wipe this recoil down real quick just to get all the heavy excess oil off of it. The recoil is good, feels good. Put that on there. Now we can put the 3 bolts back in the recoil, and these are just standard thread bolts that hold the recoil on. All right, So that's it. Recoil's back on, engine cover's back on. I'm going to go ahead and test start this thing. Flip back over again. I did forget the 4 screws. There's the 4 screws on the housing. Just going to throw those in real quick. All right, now we're ready to test fire it. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to check this throttle, make sure it's working properly. Everything feels good. I didn't break the fuel system, so it should be fine, but I'm going to go ahead and give the primer a couple squirts, make sure it's got some fuel in it. Everything looks good. Go ahead and turn the choke on. All right, she fired up. Sounds pretty good. This is an older unit. Again, this is one of our commercial customers, and this thing is older. So it's getting a little bit, it's got some hours on it, but he likes to keep them running if he can keep them running, so we will definitely do that for him when we can. So when the crank bearings on these blowers, when they start going out or they start getting loose, then they're not worth fixing. The crankshafts on these things, the bearings are not serviceable. You can't just put new crank bearings on it. You have to replace the entire crankshaft. And once that starts happening, it basically makes it to where they're not worth fixing. The crankshafts themselves, last time I looked, they were over $300 just for the crankshaft. So that is something to be aware of when you're taking these things apart. If that crank bearings, they have any kind of wiggle in them, you know, if they sound really gritty or noisy even after you clean them, then chances are it's probably going to need a crankshaft. So something to be aware of. So I'm just going to go ahead and just double check everything on this thing, give it a little bit more runtime and clean it up, and then it should be good to go for the customer. All right, I checked everything out on this blower and let it run for a little bit, and everything seems to be good to go for the customer, and it's ready to pick up. So there's a quick video on how to reseal these engine pans on BR600 and BR700 backpack blowers. Again, just keep an eye out for things like the pan wearing out or cracks or any of that type of thing, and just make sure everything's clean. When you put that surface back together again, you silicone these things, just really make sure there's no oil or dirt or anything on there. It's very important because there's no gaskets on these things. So you want to make sure you're try to be surgically clean about it if you can. So, and again, the silicone, you can either use this type of stuff that I showed earlier, you know, any type of RTV, ultra gray, that type of thing. Again, I've used them all, and I haven't seen any issues with any of them, any differences between them. So, and again, if I didn't explain the cam timing maybe if you didn't quite understand it, there's other videos out there online that you can find as far as the cam timing is concerned. I probably didn't explain it that well, and I apologize for that. I like to do it I like to do things a little bit differently, I guess, than a lot of other people. So I may not have explained that really clearly. I appreciate you watching. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you on the next one.